join me in the cut flower patch where I've been busy dividing my perennials, and I've been putting a lot of thought into perennials while I've been dividing them. And I've been trying to establish which ones I think have really earned their place in my cut flower patch and therefore will be divided and replanted in here ready for the up and coming season, and which ones perhaps I still love but would be better suited to be rehomed into the cottage garden. As always, I've bought too many packets of seed, so I'm looking forward to trying some new perennial varieties for cutting this year, which has meant that I've had to be a little bit critical in assessing the ones that I already grow, because I simply do not have room in the cut flower patch for them all. It hasn't been easy, but come with me now while we talk about which ones get to stay and make my top 10 perennials for cutting. So is it even worth growing perennials as cut flowers? Would it make more sense to give over that space to highly productive cut and come again annuals? There are some disadvantages to growing perennials as cut flowers. Apart from the fact that they take up space where perhaps something more productive can be, many perennials also have quite short flowering windows. A good example of this is obviously a peony. They're obviously beautiful, we're not debating that. They also have a good value per stem, but they do take up an awful lot of room, and they flower for such a short window. It does mean that for the rest of your season they are taking up a space in a bed. So peonies are a difficult one. Some people in fact only grow peonies because they are such a high value flower. They can more or less, if they grow enough of them, make their money off their peonies in that short flowering window. I think another thing about the perennials, particularly peonies, is that it's difficult to know when they're going to flower. They don't necessarily flower at exactly the same time every year. It really is very dependent on what happens with the weather. But obviously there must be advantages to growing perennials, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about this here today. If you have very limited or perhaps no space at all for starting seeds, perennials can easily be propagated through division, or you can take cuttings of plants that you already have. Although they can be expensive sometimes to buy in the beginning, and it takes a little bit longer to get your stock together, eventually they tend to be very, very reliable. Lots of perennials will often flower in those periods of times where you're short on annuals. I'm thinking of earlier in the season and also the dreaded May-June gap. I'm trying to think how I would manage without perennials. For me, I definitely need them for those periods of time. Now, I love all the perennials that I grow, so it's been really, really difficult for me to criticise them in any way, but I've got to be realistic here. I've already got new perennial varieties growing along in the greenhouse that I'll start to harden off soon. I've got verbascum, probably a bit of a risk for me because we do have mullein moth in the garden, well in the cottage garden anyway, so it's going to be interesting to see if my verbascum are just completely destroyed by caterpillars. And then I've got a few more varieties that I'm looking forward to try. Okay, so I'm going to go through my top 10 perennials for cut flowers. Now remember, I have not grown all the perennials that are good for cutting, so I can't really comment on those. I'm just going through the ones that I will definitely be having in my cut flower this year, and if I've got space I may try and squeeze a few more in. Like I say, I'm trying a few new varieties. I mentioned verbascum, but I'd also like to try valerian, which grows like a weed in Cornwall. So I'm hoping if it grows like a weed, it will be really useful here for cut flowers. But anyway, enough of the ones I've not even grown yet. Let's get into this top 10. So at number 10, we've got the obedient plant. I'm just going to put the Latin on the screen for you there, because obviously if you're in different countries, the Latin will be useful for you to know what plant I'm talking about. And the reason the obedient plant has made it into my top 10 is just the fact that it has these fantastic straight stems, which I suppose if you're doing flower arranging, they're possibly a bit too straight, but in retail bouquets, they really are perfect. It's a really lovely colour, and I've used the seed pods a lot in dried flowers. Now, there is a negative to the obedient plant, and for me, a bit like the peony, it does have a fairly short flowering window, which is why being able to use the seed heads for drying is useful. But I tell you what, the perennial plants grow so quickly each year. And they say to divide perennials every 3 years. I almost divide my obedient plant every year because it just grows on so well. It must like my heavy clay. So anyway, that was number 10. And then number 9 is Feed the Few. Again, I'll put the Latin up. This may surprise some of you that it's at number 9, because I know when I did my top flowers for cutting all together, it made it in there. I probably thought very highly of it. The reason it's at number 9 is actually, for me, as a perennial, it's not a great perennial, and I tend to start new seed every year. It will last the winter, but I sometimes find it comes into the spring and it's actually a little bit tired. But of course, it's still absolutely a mainstay. It's got an exceptionally long vase life, and it's a fantastic filler, and it does come in various different styles, which I won't go into now because I did go into that a little bit in the video, which I'll put in the description, the link for the video, which was my top 10 varieties to grow. And number 8 is Aquilegia, Granny's Bonnet. And the reason that's made it into my top 10 is just because it flowers quite early in the spring. And I find it really useful because sometimes I'm looking around the garden going, oh, I haven't got any flowers. And Aquilegia is always there for me. The main disadvantage I find to Aquilegia is bugs, in particular black fly. So quite often I'll find a flower which I think I can cut and use, and unfortunately I can't because it's covered in black fly. But it does self-seed everywhere, which for some people, that might be a negative, but for me it's great because it means the black fly won't necessarily have infected the Aquilegia everywhere where it is. You'll always lucky enough to find an area where it's still okay. Is the Shasta Daisy. Now, I wouldn't say I'm wild about this flower, but it does have really, really good long stems. It has a good vase life, and it flowers at a time where sometimes I'm struggling for a nice big round flower to make my bouquets sort of have all of the elements that I want in them. So I do tend to find it quite useful. Now, I just have 2 plants of this. I don't feel like I need a whole load of it, which is why it keeps its place in the cut flower patch, because as it is, it's not taking up too much room and it is useful. It does have a negative again, much the same as Aquilegia, and that is bug damage. And I think it's because it's white, and some years it's much less infested with bugs than others. Last year I had a really good year with it. You do need to cut it when it's fresh because obviously being white, it will start to brown if it's left on the plant for too long. Number 6 is Astrantia. Now the disadvantage I find with Astrantia is if I don't water it well enough, you can end up with some quite short stems. But the fact that this works so well dried and goes, you can almost put Astrantia with anything. So I love it. There's not really anything else quite like it. It's quite unique. So that's why it manages to keep its place in the garden. Number 5 is Achillea or Yarrow. Again, this dries beautifully. And when I first started selling cut flowers, I think Achillea was probably in pretty much every retail bouquet that I did, because it comes in a really good selection of colours. Lots of the other fillers, you don't get so many colours to choose from. I've got mainly tones of pinks and reds, and a few yellows, but you can almost find somewhere in the patch which will fit with any colour palette that you're working with. The only disadvantage, I suppose, to this is you do have to cut it at the right time. If you cut it too early, it will wilt. So you do need to make sure you cut it at exactly the right time. And also for me, I'm a little bit reactive to the Achillea. It's one of the only things that if I've cut a lot and I've stripped a lot and I've not been wearing gloves, I will tend to get a little bit of a skin reaction from it. Number 4 is sedum. Now, I wouldn't say that I like all sedums. Some of them can be a little bit heavy-headed, and I have grown those for cutting, and what I find I have to do is cut some of the bracts out just to make it not quite so heavy and a little bit airier. But I do have a variety of sedum, which I have no idea which one it is because I took a cutting from somebody's garden. But what I plan to do now is only have that variety in the cut flower patch and move my other sedums into the cottage garden. I wish I could tell you the variety because it is absolutely fantastic. But what I would say is that all sedums just have an exceptional vase life. They just will seem to last forever. Number 3 is gooseneck loosestrife. Now I love this. I know it does have a bend in the neck as gooseneck would suggest, and perhaps some people might think that it's sort of wilted and not supposed to look like that. But I love it, and I cannot believe how a small plant can produce so many flowers in one season. It really is. I think I bought 2 plants originally. And in the first year, I divided them straight away, so I had 4, and then I divided them again, so I had 6. And I think I only had 6 plants last year, but I can't even remember how many stems I got off of it. It was just absolutely amazing. With it being white, it will go over quite quickly. You do have to cut it at exactly the right point. But I suppose I like it because there's just not really anything else like it. I do love Veronica as a spire, but I find in my garden Veronica gets really bad powdery mildew, so I quite like having the gooseneck loosestrife instead of that. And I am going to try and sow seeds for a different colour this year because at the moment I only have white. But I do know, in fact I managed to germinate this same colour once before, but I put the plants out into the garden when they were too young and they didn't make it. So this is going to be my second attempt. Number 2 is Alchemilla mollis, Lady's Mantle. I mean, this just goes with everything, doesn't it? It's that really greeny yellow sort of colour. And depending on whether you grow it in shade or sunshine will depend on how long your stems are and also quite how acidic sort of greeny yellow they are. I love it because it's quite early in the summer again, so sometimes it can be before your dill or your beplurum or things like that I've got going. The disadvantage is that it is a self-seeder, but actually I find for me, because I tend to cut it so hard, it doesn't really get the chance to self-seed. It's only sort of my parents' garden where it self-seeds everywhere because obviously he's not cutting the flowers off regularly. So that brings us to number 1, which for me has to be Achillea tamica, which is Achillea the Pearl. And it has a very similar flower shape to feverfoo, but without the yellow. So it's quite subtle and it mixes very well with muted colour palettes. Not only that, it's definitely a hardy perennial. So whereas the feverfoo may not be so good a second year, I've lost track of how many divisions I've made to get new plants from my Achillea the Pearl. It has a brilliant vase life. Like I say, it goes with everything. The only perhaps downside to it, I would say, is obviously it does have a bit of a flowering window because it's a perennial, but also because it is white, it will show weather damage. So you need to cut it as soon as it's ready. There's no good leaving it on the flower and hoping you can cut it the next day, because if it rains, it will start to brown on the edges and it just won't look quite as crisp and quite as fresh. So I think if you are growing cut flowers as a hobby or quite small scale, I think perennial cut flowers are definitely a great option. If you get the right selection and the right varieties in your cut flower garden, you could consistently have flowers right from the start till the end of the season if you made sure you had perennials that flowered through those different periods. And if you're growing on a larger scale or you're a flower farmer, why wouldn't you have perennials if you've got space to have them? It can make your floral installations, your bouquets, possibly have just little touches that perhaps somebody else down the road of a high street florist, maybe they can't get their hands on those little perennial treats. So if you've got room, I think in conclusion, everybody's probably got room for a few perennials. Bear in mind, if you are starting a quite small scale flower farm of which you intend to make a profit and it is going to be your income and you're going to make your living from it, then perhaps it would be more sensible to look at annuals where you can get a higher value per stem, just because the way an annual works, because it only has that season to set seed, the more you cut the flowers from it, the more flowers it will try and produce, because its one goal is to reproduce that year, and if it doesn't set its seed, it's failed in that task. Whereas perennials, you know, you can cut them heavily, but they know, oh, okay, I don't set seed this year, perhaps I'll try again next year. So they don't try quite so hard. So for me, I mean, I just buy too many seeds and too many plants of everything. But for me, there's definitely a place for annuals and perennials, but I have just had to bear in mind that perhaps I don't have as much space as I would like, and that I've had to just kick a few out. Thank you very much for coming along with me for this week's video. Next week, hopefully, we should be getting in a March tour maybe, although I am quite tempted now to go and unbox my dahlias that I've been storing over the winter and see if they've made it. So one of two ways next week's video could go. Anyway, thanks very much for coming along today, and I'll see you next time.